My entitled, spoiled, and rotten older son is a complete pain to be around because he believes that everything should be given to him at the drop of a hat. Now, when I told him no, he went on a rampage and destroyed everything, prompting me and my neighbours to contact the police only to have him detained. Here's what happened in context. I'm a 35-year-old woman with a son from my first marriage. I was young when he was born, and his father was really cruel to me. My ex-husband's mother was constantly in our lives, attempting to take control and make my son her own. I left my husband when I was in my early 20s, and my ex-mother-in-law took my son to another state and filed for custody. She moved to a state that recognizes grandparents' rights, as ours did not. I fought her for years and eventually remarried to my present spouse, and we had a son together when I was in my mid-20s, who is now 10 years old. I only see my older son during the summer and vacations. I finally got the matter transferred to our local court, where the judge ruled that I had been wronged and ordered shared custody and visitation. My ex-mother-in-law insisted that my son stay with her during the week for school, and the judge agreed so that he could finish high school in a familiar atmosphere. My ex-mother-in-law, by the way, has destroyed my kid exactly as much as she wrecked her own. She has given him anything he has ever desired or asked for. She hasn't taught him any respect and has kept him very sheltered. She practically jumps on anyone who doesn't give him what he wants. As a result, my son is noisy, violent, and generally unhappy to be around. So he paid a visit on Halloween and revealed his true nature. My husband's mother lives with us, and she is not well. She is undergoing chemotherapy. She's been a huge help with my youngest son, which allows me to help my husband with our business. My youngest is a pleasure to be around. He is kind, witty, and considerate. We've taught him that you can't expect anything without working for it. I went to pick up my oldest, and his attitude began immediately since his phone died, and the charger I brought in the truck did not fit his phone. He wanted me to go off the road and get him an expensive one at a truck stop or something. I told him no, I'd get him one when we got into town, and the next time he should remember to bring one for the house and the car. I recommended creating a packing list ahead of time. My youngest was in the rear, quietly playing on his tablet, when my oldest saw it was plugged into a car charger. He asked his younger brother for the charger, and I told him it was an Apple charger that wouldn't work with his Android. My oldest said, "You don't know that." Shut up. The next thing I know, he's aggressively removing the Apple charger and attempting to insert it into his phone. When it didn't work, he put it in the back seat of the truck. My youngest just plugged his tablet back in without saying anything, but I warned my oldest son that his behavior was unacceptable. Fast forward to the present, and my oldest son is still upset with me because I had him wait, and he has badmouthed me to his grandmother. I departed for the workplace, as did my husband, and my mother-in-law planned to take my youngest kid to the tree path for Halloween. She asked my older son if he wanted to go, and he said, "Kick rocks." My husband told my oldest son not to speak to her in that manner, and I knew then that problems were developing. I just didn't realize how horrible it would be. Apparently, my mother-in-law and youngest son walked to the tree path, and my elder son contacted her to say he wanted some Hardee's, commonly known as Carl's Jr. My mother-in-law informed him that there was food at home, but that it would be a while before she could get it. My oldest son told her that she needed to deliver it to him immediately, so my mother-in-law instructed him to eat what was already in the house, or wait. My older son began cursing at her and hung up the phone. My mother-in-law then called, and I advised her not to reward his bad behavior. I told her that we had arrangements to go out to lunch later, and that he would be okay waiting. When my mother-in-law arrived home, he attempted to open the door, but her keys did not work. My oldest son came to the door and informed her he was angry and did not want her in the house, so he shut her out. He instructed her to wait outside until he felt like unlocking the door or until I arrived home. My mother-in-law instructed him to open the door immediately. She then called me, crying, and I was completely outraged. I phoned my son and told him that he does not follow the rules in my house, that he is expected to follow them, and that if he does not open the door, he will be punished. At this point, he assumed I was playing, so I left the office and returned home, which is when disaster hit. I opened the door, and my oldest son was standing on the other side. My mother-in-law and younger son had been waiting in her car, and my elder son was blocking the doorway, claiming that he had commanded my mother-in-law to stay outside, and that this was her punishment for telling him no. I told him he needed to move right now. I tried to get past him, but he shoved me back outside, threatening to lock us all out. I tried to go inside again, but he put his palm on my face and pushed me out. I'd had enough and told him, "That's it. I'm calling the cops." He didn't believe I was serious, but I actually called the cops. I informed the dispatcher that my oldest son was refusing to let me into my own home and had just placed his hands on me. When I said this, my older son fell into a complete rage. He burst out of the door, yelling profanities and threatening me. He attempted to take my phone from me, and the lady assured me that she would send someone right away. I had to physically wrestle with my older son to keep him from shattering my phone. At that time, he attempted to pursue my youngest son, telling him that he despises him and that my youngest son has somehow made his life miserable since his birth, saying that he is the only one who deserves to have me as a mother. My oldest son also claimed that he was the only true son because he was born first in my first marriage, which is complete nonsense. My mother-in-law then locked my younger son in her car, and the elder son began to kick, punch and smash the glass and windshield of her vehicle. The oldest boy chased after my mother-in-law just as my husband arrived. He was telling my mother-in-law that it was her fault and that she only had to do what he said. My husband attempted to detain him, but my older son yelled that he would have my husband arrested. The cops arrived and promptly took over, detained my kid and placed him in the back of the van. My husband and I discussed the issue, and I informed the officer that my ex-mother-in-law shared custody with my kid. So the cop called my ex-mother-in-law and told her exactly what was going on. He put her on speakerphone and she instantly blamed us, claiming that we provoked him and were the abusive ones. The officer informed her that this did not appear to be the case, as a neighbor stepped forward and stated that she had called 911 and had a security camera that recorded the entire incident. My ex-mother-in-law then rushed to the conclusion that the police here couldn't do anything with my oldest son since he lives in another state, which is completely ridiculous. The cop informed my ex-mother-in-law that this was clearly not the case, and it appeared that my older son needed to learn to control his emotions. The officer hung up, and my ex-mother-in-law immediately called me. I placed her on loudspeaker again, since I know she isn't the sharpest person on the planet. My ex-mother-in-law then stated that if my older son was arrested, it would prove that I am a bad mother, hence supporting and justifying what he had said and done, particularly his claim that he is the true son. She further validated this mindset by stating that he was my sole heir because he was my first son from my first marriage, and that divorce is a sin. I told her that's not how it works. I told her that I'm sick of his taking over my house and attempting to harm the people I love. Long story short, he spent 3 days in juvenile detention before appearing in front of a court. When the judge asked what I wanted to do, I requested that my older son be transferred to a group home. My ex-mother-in-law fought the entire time, but she had no legal basis because both officers and my neighbor made statements. Now, my ex-mother-in-law claims that I am ruining his life and that I am a bad parent, which is completely ludicrous. The older son in this narrative is an absolute terror. I mean, what exactly is wrong with him? This child was severely abused by his ex-mother-in-law. It blows my mind that she had any right to seek custody of this child in the first place. Then she goes on to contaminate this kid's mind, turning him into an awful nightmare of a human being. That's really ludicrous, and it's very unfortunate. I'm so proud of the original poster for standing up and doing the right thing. You defended yourself and your family when it mattered most. If I were in your shoes, I would have done exactly the same thing. The following one came from the AmITheA podcast subreddit. If you want to contribute your own story, follow the links in the description. Who sent Linda to prison? I am a 27-year-old man and the parent of 2 daughters. We'll call them Annie and Amy. Those are not their true names. I was shopping at the mall with my adorable little daughters when a woman who resembled a demon spawn approached me and asked where I got the dollhouse I was currently using. I responded by explaining that it was actually in the toy aisle. She thanked you and continued on her way. Now, my children are always in front of me, so I can never allow them out of my sight, and I have properly disciplined them to behave in public. We're Asians who moved here from the Philippines, but we appear quite Japanese because my parents are Japanese and originally resided in the Philippines before moving to San Francisco, where we now live. This will be essential later. So, as I was going to pay for my groceries, this woman approached me with the security guard stating, "That's him, sir. He stole the dollhouse from my shopping cart." I became a little concerned since I was confused. She first asked me where I got this playhouse, and now she claims I took it from her, which makes no sense. So security drew me out by my sleeve to the parking lot, with my girls trailing behind with a scared expression on their faces. I asked if I could negotiate with the security, but Karen had already called the cops. The cops arrived and interviewed both sides. I informed the cops, "Officer, I did not steal that from her." She inquired where I purchased the playhouse, and I just pointed to the toy aisle. There is even security footage they can use to prove my innocence. The entitled Linda then labelled me a liar, adding, "People like you steal everything from us," and that, evidently, since I'm Asian, I've stolen their homes and employment, and I should just return to my native land. My 7-year-old daughter is clinging to me, and my 4-year-old is screaming because she wants to go home. After a few moments of reviewing the film, the cops had a very good idea of the entire situation. We then paid for our belongings, and the cops inquired whether I wanted to press charges. I said yes. We subsequently discovered that the entitled Linda was under the influence of an unlawful narcotic. The security apologized for dragging me out without first asking or reasoning arguing with me. Instead, he jumped to some sort of conclusion. A few hours later, I decided to return to the store and get the current God of War game, which I will give to my nephew in December. It was the afternoon at this point, so the store was a little crowded. To my amazement, there were only 2 copies remaining. I even met this man while we were looking at the game, and he asked something along the lines of, "Oh, are you gaming for the weekend?" I simply smiled and nodded to contribute to the conversation, as I am not usually a gregarious guy. The store staff handed us both a copy, and I threw an extra controller into the cart because they were already on sale. A lady at the counter questioned me again. "Is that the latest God of War game?" "Oh, my guy will love it." I was thinking, oh no, not again. I exhaled deeply and murmured to myself, "Here we go again." So I told the lady, "Yeah, I'm sure he'll love it." Surprisingly, I made it through the counter without incident, but now things have become worse. Linda tried to bump into me, thinking I would drop my bag and we would get our bags mixed up. To some extent, it did work. I told her, "Hold up, let me check the contents of my pack." And, to my amazement, there was a hairdryer inside. So I said, "I think our bags got switched." At this point, the entitled Linda refused to hand over my luggage, so I detained her, forced her to the ground, and called the cops. I could tell this lady wanted both the God of War game and the controller I was about to get. 10 minutes later, the cops arrived and requested that I let go of the lady. Again, I told the cops that Linda was attempting to steal from me, and that there was security tape to back up my allegation, which clearly shows that the bags were switched. A store clerk also informed the cops that there were only 2 copies of the game remaining, of which I obtained. I also have the receipt in the left pocket of my blazer as proof. Again, Linda was high, so she was charged with both being under the influence of an illegal narcotic and theft. The nicest part of my day, however, is that they are 2 distinct interactions. I met 2 separate Linda in the span of one day, and that honestly blows my mind. This original poster has extraordinary luck. They got 2 Linda on the same day, and both of them were under the influence, which is really bizarre. I think you should go shopping somewhere else because it sounds like there are a lot of dodgy people around that spot. So no, I don't believe you are the jerk. You did precisely what you needed to do, and maybe in the future you will be able to avoid these Linda and shop in peace. My entitled co-worker, who made my life a nightmare while working for the same firm, is eventually dismissed and becomes homeless, and he has no one else to blame but himself. This is what occurred. So, to provide some context, I spent 5 years working for a call centre called Ultima. Following my induction in 2016, I was assigned to a campaign with the codename Quebec, which handles customer and technical assistance for a driving app. I remember it because it was poorly managed. People were continually rotated, and we had at least 4 bosses by the end of Quebec, as I shall describe later. All of the names of people and corporations have been changed for personal and privacy reasons. On to the main story. It's January 2017. My initial supervisor and some of my co-workers were fired owing to some shady fraud, so I was sent to a new team. I only survived because I seldom engaged with anyone, including my boss. I quickly became friends with 3 co-workers after joining this new team. We'll call them Carl, Audrey and Brianna, all fictitious names. While the 4 of us were together, I noticed a 5th co-worker arrive, who was probably 10 years older than the rest of us and resembled Gollum from The Lord of the Ring. We will call him Frank. I'd seen him around, chatting with my then supervisor until his dismissal, but he was none of my concern at the time. Frank approached us with an arrogant tone, asking that we shut up and continue with our separate jobs. I glanced at Frank with contempt, thinking, who does this guy think he is? He then approached me, looked me in the eye and said, "I recognize you. Your team was booted out because they committed fraud. You do as I say, or I'll have HR remove you." At that point I said, "What? Is he threatening me without reason?" Frank eventually left, staring at me like he had just stepped into a new dog excrement. Following the incident, my friend Carl messaged me in a private conversation, asking what had happened to my team. I told him that my crew had been fired due to some fraudulent activities. He then explained that some of his teammates had also been kicked out for the same reason. Another friend then joined the chat, stating that since becoming floor support, Frank has been on a power trip, demanding that everyone labour like robots. He not only does this with our team, but he also barges into other teams and terrorises them into silence. Carl went on to say that others tried to report him to their managers and even HR, but they were unsuccessful since everyone was favouring him. We kept working and conversing in the meantime, just trying to get through our time here. Then came March 2017. Bruce, who was then an operations manager, quit, and Michael, an operations manager from another campaign, took over. There are several modifications and names. As a result, our crew was divided. I was transferred to another team, and Frank was moved to the morning shift, which meant I wouldn't have to deal with his attitude for the time being. Fast forward to early 2018, and new adjustments have occurred within the campaign. You understand what that means. Team changes were in the works. By this point, 2 of my original friends were no longer working. I was paired up with Carl again, as well as a few newcomers, but things became even worse when Frank was put back on our shift. It turns out that the new manager learned that Frank had already been mistreating the morning shift, and she wasn't having it. As a result, Frank was demoted to the afternoon shift and assigned to our team, which was the only one available to him. Even in his new role, Frank continued to behave like an entitled jerk, but this time he was much more nasty and uncaring. Things deteriorated significantly throughout our time working with Frank. Whenever one of my co-workers was simply trying to do their job, Frank would continue to outdo them, claiming his extensive knowledge as an excuse. Actually, he would do the same for all of the team leaders. One of these days, I was in a terrible mood after a disagreement with my supervisor about an unpaid day of labor. The last straw came when I returned from lunch and saw Frank call one of my co-workers a stupid peasant. This is when I snapped and yelled at him, ordering him to shut up and yelling about how he had made this workplace a living nightmare. My boss witnessed the disagreement, broke it up, and summoned me, Frank, and the co-worker he was disparaging to testify in front of HR. Expecting the worst because Frank was still buddies with the HR staff, I was ultimately contacted, along with the supervisor who got Frank demoted and the HR representative who handled this issue. After Frank and the co-worker he was mocking offered their accounts of the incident, I gave my final interpretation of what transpired. My boss also provided video evidence that Frank was a jerk. I was eventually dismissed from the meeting with only a verbal warning for harsh language. Frank was finally suspended for 1 week and assigned to the graveyard shift. For the remainder of that time, things were relatively quiet. Fast forward to March 2020, and I, Carl, and another co-worker were still on board, but several of my co-workers had recently resigned. We had little to no communication with Frank, since we were tired of all the rubbish he had put us through. It goes without saying that the COVID-19 pandemic had already struck, and we were all in the midst of transitioning to a home office environment, which meant we wouldn't have any interaction with Frank at all. Time passed, and we had effectively adjusted to working from home. The only contact we would have would be with our team, our supervisor, and the floor supports. But this didn't last long, because on June 1st we received a link to a Microsoft Teams meeting. To summarize, we were informed that due to the numerous issues caused by the epidemic, the client who had contacted the company decided to discontinue the codename Quebec. I was offered and accepted the opportunity to work on another campaign, but everyone else, including Frank, was terminated and fired. As of November 2022, for the final time, I left my previous company in June 2021 to join another. Some of my buddies organised a little party to celebrate. To my amazement, the supervisor who defended me was also present, enjoying a great chat and a night of drinks and entertainment. At that point, Frank's ultimate fate became clear to me. I was told Frank was being arrogant and blaming us for his current condition. It was also revealed that Frank had been unable to find another job and was unable to continue paying rent. Therefore, he was eventually evicted from his apartment. Frank is now homeless, and we've heard nothing else about him. You know what? I don't feel awful about his fate, but I don't feel like celebrating either. In the end, Frank was the sole victim, and he did it all to himself. Such a horrible story. I mean, talk about someone who definitely had it coming. In my opinion, if you send negative energy into the world in this way, karma will come back to punish you hard. I mean, this guy lost his job, couldn't pay his rent, and is now homeless. It's unfortunate, but if he had been a better guy, he could have gotten a letter of recommendation and found another job. So it's simply a sad circumstance. So if anything, this is a lesson in treating others with respect, since you never know what life will throw at you. Thank you for watching. When you subscribe, be sure you tap the bell to enable notifications.